Chapter 3, Part 1 of Gigolo by Edna Ferber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gigolo, Part 1. In the first place, gigolo is slang. In the second place, with no desire to appear patronizing, but one's French conversation class does not include the argot, it is French slang. In the third place, the G-I-G is pronounced gig, and the whole is not a respectable word. Finally, it is a term of utter contempt. A gigolo, generally speaking, is a man who lives off women's money. In the mad year 1922, A.W., a gigolo, definitely speaking, designated one of those incredible and pathetic male creatures born of the war, who, for 10 francs or more, or even less, would dance with any woman wishing to dance on the crowded floors of public tea-rooms, dinner or supper rooms in the cafes, hotels, and restaurants of France. Lean, sallow, handsome, expert, and unwholesome, one saw them everywhere, their slim waists and sleek heads in juxtaposition to plump, respectable American matrons and slender, respectable American flappers. For that matter, feminine respectability of almost every nationality, except the French, yielded itself to the skilful guidance of the genus gigolo in the tango or foxtrot. Naturally, no decent French girl would have been allowed for a single moment to dance with a gigolo, but America, touring Europe like mad after years of enforced absence, outnumbered all other nations a-travel 10-1. By no feat of fancy could one imagine Gideon Gorey of the Winnebago, Wisconsin Gories employed daily and nightly as a gigolo in the gilt and marble restaurants that try to out-sparkle the Mediterranean along the Promenade des Anglais in Nice. Gideon Gorey of Winnebago, Wisconsin. Why, anyone knows that the Gories were to Winnebago what the Romanoffs were to Russia: royal, remote, omnipotent. Yet the Romanoffs went in the cataclysm, and so too did the Gories. To appreciate the depths to which the boy Gideon had fallen, one must have known the Gories in their glory. It happened something like this. The Gories lived for years in the great, ugly, sprawling, luxurious old frame house on Cass Street. It was high up on the bluff overlooking the Fox River, and, incidentally, the huge pulp and paper mills across the river in which the Gory money had been made. The Gories were so rich and influential, for Winnebago, Wisconsin, that they didn't bother to tear down the old frame house and build a stone one, or to cover its faded front with cosmetics of stucco. In most things the Gories led where Winnebago could not follow. They disdained to follow where Winnebago led. The Gories had an automobile when those vehicles were entered from the rear, and when Winnebago roads were a wallow of mud in the spring and fall, and a snow-lined trench in the winter. The family was of the town, and yet apart from it. The Gories knew about golf, and played it in far foreign playgrounds, when the rest of us thought of it as something vaguely Scotch, like haggis. They had oriental rugs and hardwood floors, when the town still stepped on carpets. And by the time the rest of the town had caught up on rugs, the Gories had gone back to carpets, neutral tinted. They had fireplaces in bedrooms, and used them like characters in an English novel. Old Madame Gory had a slim patent leather foot with a buckle, and carried a sunshade when she visited the flowers in the garden. Old Gideon was rumoured to have wine with his dinner. Gideon Junior, father of Giddy, smoked cigarettes with his monogram on them. Schroeder's grocery ordered endive for them, all blanched and delicate in a wicker basket from France or Belgium, when we had just become accustomed to head lettuce. Every prosperous small American town has its gory family. Every small-town newspaper relishes the savoury tidbits that fall from the rich table of the family life. Thus you saw that Mr. and Mrs. Gideon Gorey, Jr., have returned from California, where Mr. Gorey had gone for the polo. Mr. and Mrs. Gideon Gorey, Jr., announced the birth, in New York, of a son, Gideon III, our, in a manner of speaking, hero. Mr. and Mrs. Gideon Gorey, Jr., and son Gideon III, left to-day for England and the Continent. It is understood that Gideon III will be placed at school in England. Mr. and Mrs. Gideon Gorey, accompanied by Madame Gorey, have gone to Chicago for a week of the Grand Opera. Born of all this, you would have thought that young Giddy would grow up a somewhat objectionable young man, and so, in fact, he did, though not nearly so objectionable as he might well have been, considering things in general, and his mother in particular. At 16, for example, Giddy was driving his own car, a car so exaggerated and low-slung, and with such a long, predatory, and glittering nose, that one marvelled at the expertness with which he swung its slim length around the corners of our narrow, tree-shaded streets. He was a real Gorey, was Giddy, with his thick, waving black hair, which he tried for vain years to train into docility, his lean, swart face, and his slightly hooked, gory nose. In appearance, Winnebago pronounced him foreign-looking, an attribute which he later turned into a doubtful asset in Nice. On the rare occasions when Giddy graced Winnebago with his presence, you were likely to find him pursuing the pleasures that occupied other Winnebago boys of his age, if not his station. In some miraculous way he had escaped being a snob. Still, training and travel combined to lead him into many innocent errors. When he dropped into Fetzer's pool shack carrying a Malacca cane, for example, he had carried a cane every day for 6 months in Paris, whence he had just returned. Now it was as much a part of his street attire as his hat. More, to be exact, for the hatless head had just then become the street mode. There was a good game of Kelly in progress. Giddy, leaning slightly on his stick, stood watching it. Suddenly he was aware that all about the dim, smoky little room players and loungers were standing in attitudes of exaggerated elegance, each leaning on a cue, his elbow crooked in as near an imitation of Giddy's position as the stick's length would permit. The figure was curved so that it stuck out behind and before. The expression on each face was as asinine as its owner's knowledge of the comic weekly swell could make it. The little finger of the free hand was extravagantly bent. The players themselves walked with a mincing step about the table. And, "My dear fella, what a pretty play. Mean to say, neat, don't you know?" came incongruously from the lips of Reddy Ledigan, whose father ran the Lenigan house on Outagamy Street. He spatted his large hands delicately together in further expression of approval. "Think so?" giggled his opponent, Mr. Duchy Meisenberg. Ah, fly, sweet of you to say so, old thing." He tucked his unspeakable handkerchief up his cuff and coughed behind his palm. He turned to Giddy. "Excuse my not having my coat on, dear boy." Just here Giddy might have done a number of things, all wrong. The game was ended. He walked to the table, and, using the offending stick as a cue, made a rather pretty shot that he had learned from Benoit in London. Then he ranged the cane neatly on the rack with the cues. He even grinned a little boyishly. "You win," he said. "My treat. What'll you have?" Which was pretty sporting for a boy whose American training had been what Giddy's had been. Giddy's father, on the death of old Gideon, proved himself much more expert at dispensing the paper mill money than at accumulating it. After old Madame Gorry's death, just 1 year following that of her husband, Winnebago saw less and less of the 3 remaining members of the royal family. The frame house on the river bluff would be closed for a year or more at a time. Giddy's father rather liked Winnebago, and would have been content to spend 6 months of the year in the old Gorry house. But Giddy's mother, who had been a Leyden of New York, put that idea out of his head pretty effectively. "Don't talk to me," she said, "about your duty toward the town that gave you your money and all that kind of feudal rot, because you know you don't mean it. It bores you worse than it does me, really, but you like to think that the villagers are pulling a forelock when you walk down Normal Avenue. As a matter of fact, they're not doing anything of the kind. They've got their thumbs to their noses, more likely." Her husband protested rather weakly. "I don't care. I like the old shack. I know the heating apparatus is bum, and that we get the smoke from the paper mills, but I don't know. Last year, when we had that pink palace at Cannes, I kept thinking—" Mrs. Gideon Gorry raised the Leyden eyebrow. "Don't get sentimental, Gid, for God's sake. It's a shanty, and you know it. And you know that it needs everything from plumbing to linen. I don't see any sense in sinking thousands in making it livable when we don't want to live in it." "But I do want to live in it once in a while. I'm used to it. I was brought up in it. So was the kid. He likes it too, don't you, Giddy?" The boy was present, as usual, at this particular scene. The boy worshipped his mother. But also he was honest. So, "Yeah, I like the old barn all right," he confessed. Encouraged, his father went on. "Yesterday the kid was standing out there on the bluff edge, breathing like a whale, weren't you, Giddy? And when I asked him what he was puffing about, he said he liked the smell of the sulphur and chemicals and stuff from the paper mills. Didn't you, kid?" Shamefacedly, "Yeah," said Giddy. Betrayed thus by husband and adored son, the Leyden did battle. "You can both stay here, then," she retorted with more spleen than elegance, "and sniff sulphur until you're black in the face. I'm going to London in May." They, too, went to London in May, of course, as she had known they would. She had not known, though, that in leading her husband to England in May she was leading him to his death as well. "All Winnebago will be shocked and grieved to learn," said the Winnebago Courier, to the extent of 2 columns and a cut, "of the sudden and violent death in England of her foremost citizen, Gideon Gorry. Death was due to his being thrown from his horse while hunting." To be thrown from his horse while hunting. Shocked and grieved though it might or might not be, Winnebago still had the fortitude to savour this with relish. Winnebago had died deaths natural and unnatural. It had been run over by automobiles, and had its skull fractured at football, and had been drowned in Lake Winnebago, and struck by lightning, and poisoned by mushrooms, and shot by burglars. But never had Winnebago citizen had the distinction of meeting death by being thrown from his horse while hunting. While hunting! Scarlet coats, hounds in full cry, baronial halls, hunt breakfasts, Vogue, Vanity Fair. Well, Winnebago was almost grateful for this final and most picturesque gesture of Gideon Gorey II. The widow Leyden did not even take the trouble personally to superintend the selling of the Gorey place on the river bluff. It was sold by an agent while she and Giddy were in Italy, and if she was ever aware that the papers in the transaction stated that the house had been bought by Orson J. Hubbell, she soon forgot the fact and the name. Giddy, leaning over her shoulder while she handled the papers, and signing on the line indicated by a legal forefinger, may have remarked, "Hubbell, that's old Hubbell, the drayman. Must be money in the draying line." Which was pretty stupid of him, because he should have known that the draying business was now developed into the motor truck business, with great vans roaring their way between Winnebago and Kaukauna, Winnebago and Neenah, and even Winnebago and Oshkosh. He learned that later. Just now Gideon wasn't learning much of anything, and, to do him credit, the fact distressed him not a little. His mother insisted that she needed him, and developed a bad heart whenever he rebelled and threatened to sever the apron strings. They lived abroad entirely now. Mrs. Gorey showed a talent for spending the Gorey gold that must have set old Gideon to whirling in his Winnebago grave. Her spending of it was foolish enough, but her handling of it was criminal. She loved Europe. America bored her. She wanted to identify herself with foreigners, with foreign life. Against advice, she sold her large and lucrative interest in the Winnebago paper mills, and invested great sums in French stocks, in Russian enterprises, in German shares. She liked to be mistaken for a Frenchwoman. She and Gideon spoke the language like natives, or nearly. She was vain of Gideon's un-American looks, and cross with him when, on their rare and brief visits to New York, he insisted that he liked American tailoring and American-made shoes. Once or twice, soon after his father's death, he had said, casually, "You didn't like Winnebago, did you? Living in it, I mean." "Like it?" "Well, these English, I mean, and French. They sort of grow up in a place and stay with it and belong to it. See what I mean? And it gives you a kind of permanent feeling. Not patriotic exactly, but solid and native heathy and Scots wad hae wi' Wallace and all that kind of slop." "Giddy, darling, don't be silly." Occasionally, too, he said, "Look here, Julia." She liked this modern method of address. "Look here, Julia, I ought to be getting busy, doing something. Here I am, 19, and I can't do a thing except dance pretty well, but not as well as that South American eel we met last week. Mix a cocktail pretty well, but not as good a one as Benny the bartender turns out at Voyot's. Ride pretty well, but not as well as the English chaps. Drive a car—" She interrupted him there. Drive a car better than even an Italian chauffeur. Had you there, Giddy darling?" She undoubtedly had Giddy darling there. His driving was little short of miraculous, and his feeling for the intricate inside of a motor engine was as delicate and unerring as that of a professional pianist for his pet pianoforte. They motored a good deal, with France as a permanent background, and all Europe as a playground. They flitted about the continent, a whirl of glittering blue and cream enamel, tan leather coating, fur robes, air cushions, gold-topped flasks, and petrol. Giddy knew Como and Villa d'Este as the place where the pretty Hungarian widow had borrowed 1,000 liras from him at the casino roulette table, and never paid him back. London as a pleasing potpourri of briar pipes, smart leather gloves, music-hall reviews, and night-clubs. Berlin as a rather stuffy hole where they tried to ape Paris and failed, but you had to hand it to Charlotte when it came to the skating at the Eispalast. A pleasing existence, but unprofitable. No one saw the cloud gathering because of cloud there was none, even of the man's hand size so often discerned as a portent. When the storm broke, this must be hurriedly passed over, because of the "let's not talk about the war, I'm so sick of it, aren't you" feeling, Giddy promptly went into the Lafayette escadrille. Later he learned never to mention this to an American, because the American was so likely to say, "There must have been about 11 million scrappers in that outfit. Every fella you meet's been in the Lafayette escadrille. If all the guys were in it that say they were, they could have licked the Germans the first day out. That outfit's worse than the old Florodora sextet." Mrs. Gorry was tremendously proud of him, and not as worried as she should have been. She thought it all a rather smart game, and not at all serious. She wasn't even properly alarmed about her European money, at first. Giddy looked thrillingly distinguished and handsome in his aviation uniform. When she walked in Paris streets with him, she glowed like a girl with her lover. But after the first 6 months of it, Mrs. Gorry, grown rather drawn and haggard, didn't think the whole affair quite so delightful. She scarcely ever saw Giddy. She never heard the drum of an airplane without getting a sick, gone feeling at the pit of her stomach. She knew now that there was more to the air service than a becoming uniform. She was doing some war work herself, in an incompetent, frenzied sort of way. With Giddy soaring high, and her foreign stocks and bonds falling low, she might well be excused for the panic that shook her from the time she opened her eyes in the morning until she tardily closed them at night. "Let's go home, Giddy darling," like a scared child. "Where's that?" "Don't be cruel. America's the only safe place now." "Too darned safe." This was 1915. By 1917 she was actually in need of money, but Giddy did not know much about this, because Giddy had, roughly speaking, got his. He had the habit of soaring up into the sunset and sitting around in a large pink cloud like a kid bouncing on a feather bed. Then one day he soared higher and farther than he knew, having perhaps grown careless through over-confidence. He heard nothing above the roar of his own engine, and the two planes were upon him almost before he knew it. They were not French, or English, or American planes. He got one of them, and would have got clean away if the other had not caught him in the arm. The right arm. His mechanician lay limp. Even then he might have managed a landing, but the pursuing plane got in a final shot. There followed a period of time that seemed to cover, say, 6 years, but that was actually only a matter of seconds. At the end of that period, Giddy, together with a tangle of wire, silk, wood, and something that had been the mechanician, lay inside the German lines, and you would hardly have thought him worth the disentangling. They did disentangle him, though, and even patched him up pretty expertly, but not so expertly, perhaps, as they might have, being enemy surgeons, and rather busy with patching their own injured. The bone, for example, in the lower right arm, knitted promptly and properly, being a young and healthy bone, but they rather overlooked the matter of arm nerves and muscles, so that later, though it looked a perfectly proper arm, it couldn't lift 4 pounds. His head had emerged slowly, month by month, from swathings of gauze. What had been quite a crevasse in his skull became only a scarlet scar that his hair pretty well hid when he brushed it over the bad place. But the surgeon, perhaps being overly busy, or having no real way of knowing that Giddy's nose had been a distinguished and aristocratically hooked gory nose, had remoulded that wrecked feature into a pure Greek line, at first sight of which Giddy stood staring weakly into the mirror with surprise and horror and unbelief and general misery. "Can this be I?" he thought, feeling like the old man of the bramble bush in the Mother Goose rhyme. A well-made and becoming nose, but not so fine-looking as the original feature had been, as worn by Giddy. "Look here," he protested to the surgeon, months too late. "Look here, this isn't my nose." "Be glad," replied that practical Prussian person, "that you have any." With his knowledge of French and English and German, Giddy acted as interpreter during the months of his invalidism and later internment, and things were not so bad with him. He had no news of his mother, though, and no way of knowing whether she had news of him. With 1918 and the armistice, he hurried to Paris, and there got the full impact of the past year's events. Julia Gory was dead, and the Gory money non-existent. Out of the ruins, a jewel or two, and some paper not quite worthless, he managed a few thousand francs, and went to Nice. There he walked in the sunshine, and sat in the sunshine, and even danced in the sunshine, a dazed young thing, together with hundreds of other dazed young things, not thinking, not planning, not hoping, existing only in a state of semi-consciousness, like one recovering from a blinding blow. The francs dribbled away. Sometimes he played baccarat and won. Oftener he played baccarat and lost. He moved in a sort of trance, feeling nothing. Vaguely he knew that there was a sort of conference going on in Paris. Sometimes he thought of Winnebago, recalling it remotely, dimly, as one is occasionally conscious of a former unknown existence. Twice he went to Paris for periods of some months, but he was unhappy there, and even strangely bewildered, like a child. He was still sick in mind and body, though he did not know it. Driftwood, like thousands of others, tossed up on the shore after the storm, lying there, bleached and useless and battered. Then one day in Nice there was no money, not a franc, not a centime. He knew hunger, he knew terror, He knew desperation. It was out of this period that there emerged Giddy the Gigolo. Now, though, the name bristled with accent marks, thus Gédéon Goré. This Gédéon Goré of the Nice Dansant did not even remotely resemble Gideon Gorey of Winnebago, Wisconsin. This Gédéon Goré wore French clothes of the kind that Giddy Gorey had always despised. A slim, sallow, sleek, sad-eyed gigolo in tight French garments, the pants rather flappy at the ankle, effeminate French shoes with fawn-coloured uppers and patent leather eyelets and vamps, most despicable. A slim cane, hair with a magnificent natural wave that looked artificially marcelled, and that was worn with a strip growing down from the temples on either side, in the sort of cut used only by French dandies and English stage butlers. No, this was not Giddy Gorey. The real Giddy Gorey lay in a smart but battered suitcase under the narrow bed in his lodgings. The suitcase contained: Item: 1 grey tweed suit with name of London tailor inside. Item: 1 pair Russian calf Oxfords of American make. Item: 1 French aviation uniform with leather coat, helmet, and gloves, all bearing stiff and curious splotches of brown or rust colour, which you might not recognize as dried blood-stains. Item: 1 handful assorted medals, ribbons, orders, etc. End of Chapter 3, Part 1.